This is TWiT.
We've got some catching up to do. And you may have heard about the whole Epic Games and Apple saga that took place quite a while ago now. And maybe you thought that, things had quieted down and that all was good and well in those camps. But it turns out there is more happening. There is more to it. And we are joined today by Rene Ritchie to give us a bit of an update. Welcome back to the show, Rene.
Oh, it is always so outstanding to talk with you, Mikah.
Ooh, you got a plant. I like it.
I moved it. It was a previously hidden plant, and now it is slowly taking over.
That means it's growing.
The plant
You're doing
moved
well.
Itself, actually.
Yes, exactly.
It did.
It grew more towards you because it's like
plant.
A beacon of light. So anyway, now that I'm not distracted by the plant squirrel, I do want to ask you if you could give kind of a brief, before we talk about what's happening now, for anyone who's watching this for the first time today and maybe had no idea what was going on between Epic and Apple, can you give kind of just a little bit of a timeline of what's led up to this point before we talk about the latest news?
Sure, absolutely. So Epic updated their app and they included something that they called the drop. And it turned out that what this did was code that they enabled over the server that switched to alternate payment methods in iTunes, not in iTunes anymore, the App Store and the Google Play Store, which meant that people could pay them directly and not have to give a cut to Apple or to Google. And both Apple and Google didn't take very kindly to that and encouraged them to reverse this action very quickly. Epic doubled down, so both Apple and Google removed them from their respective stores, and then Epic sued Apple, and I think a lot of people were like, yes, take it to Apple, that proprietary juggernaut, but then they sued Google as well, even though Google allows sideloading, so theoretically anybody could install any version of Fortnite, that was within the bounds of Google's policy, but could install any version anyway. And then people started digging through the lawsuit, and it turns out that Epic wants something very specific. They don't want to take down the big gatekeepers that we have now, namely Apple and Google. They want to become their own gatekeeper. They want to bring the Epic Store not only to iOS and Android, but they want the distribution potential of having the Epic Store on the App Store and on the Google Play Store, something they've done very effectively on the PC, including doing things like making exclusives in order to try to crush the Steam app and give the Epic Store an advantage. And they've just been cascading these lawsuits now. They even got people in the States they got lobbyists in the States to propose legislation that didn't pass, but they're doing an all-out war in the EU, in the US, and with a lot of lobbyists at their disposal.
So yeah, let's actually start there. The lobbying, because that was kind of the first bit of new news that took place. Can you give a little bit more detail about what was going on with the lobbying? Because there was some legislation that was introduced, and at first it maybe seemed like it was just legislation that these groups had brought forth, but then we suddenly started to see where the sources of that legislation came from, and it ended up being Epic. What exactly was the legislation attempting to do? If you can give it to us in details of, should that legislation have passed, I, as an everyday consumer, go to my app store or go to my phone, what changes on the phone if that legislation had passed? So, I mean,
basically they hired lobbyists, and the lobbyists gave legislators this bill to introduce, which is not uncommon. That's how a lot of this stuff works. Unfortunately, we live in a society where lobbyists have a lot of influence over politicians. Mm-hmm. And it's unclear what the actual bill would have been, because a lot of times these things change in committee and change when they're on the floor. There's a lot of negotiations. But in broad strokes, they want the ability for Apple to allow their store, not just their apps, but their store onto iOS and Android, so that you would go to the App Store or the Play Store, you would download the Epic store, and then you would only use that store for all of Epic's properties and everyone that they sign underneath them after that. And also you'd be able to pay not just using your Apple account or your Google account, you'd be able to pay using theoretically an Epic account or PayPal or some other form of currency. And I am of such mixed minds on this. Like when it comes to game streaming, I'm 100% on Microsoft and Sony and Google's side. I think there should just be game streaming on iOS. But with this one, it becomes nuanced because the App Store was designed as a console. From the first time Steve Jobs introduced it, he made it clear this was a closed console, like a video game system meant to run apps in a way that was very accessible to the mainstream. And his whole life's mission was to make technology more mainstream. He didn't want to make more computers for us nerds, us geeks. He figured we had all the traditional computers. He wanted to make something like an iPad that was made for people who felt traditional computers were inaccessible or intimidating. And the problem is that we love these devices too. And so we want to make them nerdy as well. And it doesn't matter that we have Android that lets you sideload, or that we have Windows, or we have the Mac. We kind of want all of these machines. And I worry that in multifaceted ways, including this, I personally would love sideloading on iOS. I think Gatekeeper on iOS would be terrific. But I worry that we're taking away mainstream options just to have yet another geek option in our hands.
Yeah, and I think that, I completely understand that, and it's something that it kind of constantly, I think for Jason, you and I both, as people who regularly answer questions of folks who are using technology, and Rene, you too, the potential for issues there. You think about somebody saying, seeing some story where somebody's installed an app on their phone and it had to be sideloaded, and there are those concerns there. So yeah, I kind of wanted, you've almost touched on the next question that I want to ask you. Before we get there though, what is the latest in the saga in terms of Epic? So of course it's tried to go to the EU, which in the past has pushed forward some regulations that maybe we wouldn't see in other places. And so Epic is now in the EU, kind of trying to continue its disputes, continue its course in kind of going back at Apple and the App Store with antitrust legislation. And this is one instance of that. We've also had a group of different apps that have worked to also claim this, Spotify being one of those, and an email app as well, I think called Hey. So what is the regulation surrounding right now? And then my bigger question to you, and I think the more important question is, where are the places that maybe you see this leading that folks are not considering on the face of it? So what are maybe some quote unquote slippery slope outcomes of legislation like this, if you could predict?
Sure. I mean, historically, the U.S., the Department of Justice, has tried to lower pricing. Like, a lot of their decisions are made to create competition that ends up with consumers paying less. And in the EU, they just want to increase competition, but their motivations often don't align with the actual results. For example, famously, they wanted to force the browsers to be more competitive. They enacted a bunch of policies on Microsoft, including browser ballots, where you could choose your browser. And as an end result of all of this, they have destroyed almost every browser rendering engine except for the WebKit derivatives. We basically have WebKit and Chromium now, and Gecko is like surviving on a lifeline. But even Microsoft doesn't use their own rendering engine anymore. So I think they often don't see the repercussions for the political points in all this. And that's sort of my worry. You have Epic, which I think is actually worse than Apple. They make their store is terrible, like objectively terrible on Windows. And they seem to, I love independent apps. You and I both. So many of our friends make independent apps. I would rather the courts and public opinion and everybody be focusing on the issues that really matter to them, that help them have more sustainable businesses, things like trials and upgrades. I think Epic just wants to be a worse version of Google and Apple. And you see companies like Facebook is now supporting them because they're all salty about the privacy pop-ups that are coming to Apple and probably to Google at some point. And also, like you said, Spotify. And these are companies that historically have had huge problems respecting, like, they complain that they're not being allowed to make the money they should make, when a lot of their money is made off of, in Epic's case, skins and emotes, which were just stolen from the people who made up those dances. I mean, it's a whole slippery slope. And I would really rather the attention gets moved more off of them and more onto those people like James Thompson and David Barnard and everyone trying to make a better app community, not only for their own enrichment, but especially in these cases for their survival and for the actual delight and experience of their customers.
I agree.
Sorry, I'm ranting today, Mikah.
No, but that's okay, because I think that that this story, especially in its ongoing nature, some of the kind of nuance and the sort of understory gets lost, and it's important to focus on that and make sure that, you know, as you've noted, this sort of idea of the little guy taking on the big guy, but when you start to look at the actions and the outcomes, you see that maybe that's the narrative that the company is trying to push forward in the interest of pushing forth something that will be positive for it, but maybe not be positive for the consumer.
Can I give you one more quick example?
Absolutely.
So they had a hearing in the U.S. and the judge was really well informed, and I don't think they expected that. She was absolutely terrific, and they kept putting up spurious arguments that she was knocking down, to the point where when the second line of questioning began, the lawyer said, "I don't even know if I should bother anymore," which is one of those things you really shouldn't say if you're a lawyer. But the judge asked if Apple and Epic were willing to put the money that they were collecting into trust, so that customers could still keep playing the game, and then at the end of the process, whoever won could get that money. And Apple said yes, the judge liked it. Epic said no, they had no intention of letting people continue to play Fortnite while they sued this out with Apple. And to me, again, that just showed the different intentions behind the different groups.